Hey, my name is Bernhard Schussek. I'm from Austria. It's actually my first time in the US, so I'm quite happy to speak before of you. I know some of you people, but many of you I don't, and I hope my English is acceptable for like lots of native speakers. So today I'm going to talk about the Symfony form component. My talk today won't be about the basics. It won't be about starting to use the form component. It won't be about like how to create a form, how to render a form, like the basic stuff that you can all find in the documentation. This talk is going to be tough. It's going to be hardcore, you know? So be prepared. Be nervous. I am too. So. Today I'm going to talk about 3 different topics, basically. I'm going to introduce you to a small example, and then I will be talking about data formats and how it is important in forms to store data in different formats, namely in the one that you use in your application and the one that is used in the view layer. And I'm talking about data mapping, which is the process of copying data from a form to its fields and back. And the last topic I'll be talking about is events that allow you to create highly dynamic, highly flexible forms, and how they work, how you can use them to leverage the full power of the Symfony form component. So the example that I'm using today is the simple employee form. It just has three fields for like demonstration purposes: a name field, which is a simple text input, a salary field, which is a simple money input, and a birth date field, which is a simple date field. Okay. So from Symfony's perspective, or Symfony creates an object-oriented model for that form. And to start with, all of the form is an object. It's a form object of class form, basic simple. Also, every field is an object. So you have 3 fields or 3 objects for the 3 fields in the form. And down below there, if you can see the laser pointer, down below you see the tree representation. So on the left side there is the big form, the root form, and every of the fields in the form is a child node of that form, okay? And last but not least, we have 3 different drop-downs within the date field, which also are represented by form instances. Okay, so you end up with this nice, simple form tree. You receive this form tree whenever you create a new form. In the end, you receive the root form instance, which you are using the controller to call bind, to call is valid, all that stuff. So whenever you use a form in your controller, it's the root of such a form tree. Okay? But forms, if we represent them like that, they are not very expressive. We need some way to identify the different forms within that tree. That's why we gave them names. So the root form in our case is named employee. Then we have the 3 fields name, salary, birth date, and the birth date has 3 fields named day, month, and year. Straightforward. These names are chosen by you when you create the form and when you configure the fields of the form. So you can use the form factory. You can also use the create method in your controller. And if you use the form factory, you can actually choose a name. If you use the create method in the controller, you cannot. But it doesn't matter that much. And when you add fields there, you can also provide the names of these fields. Okay? So these names can also be used to retrieve the objects from the form tree. So you can use the get method to receive a child of that form, of the root form, and you can chain that to receive any of the children within the form tree. Okay? Okay. The second important property, forms have types. You probably know about that. Every form has a type which corresponds to the way that this form is rendered, is processed, is converted, and all of that stuff. So in our case, it's very simple. Name is of type text, salary is of type money, birthday is of type birthday, and so on and so forth. Okay, you probably know all about these types. You choose these types when you create the form as well. So if you add fields, you can choose the type. You can also leave it away, then Symfony will do that automatically. And yeah, this should be nothing new for you. So first property, each form has a name. Second property, each form has a type. Third property, each form has data. When you display a form for the first time, you usually want to display some default values. That's the data of the form. When you submit the form, you enter a new value into the fields. That is also the data of the form. So you just overwrite the old data with the submitted values. Okay. In the life cycle of a form at first has no data at all. It's new. You create it. Then you have the option to call setData to initialize it with some data. It's a default value that you want to display in the form when you display it. Yeah. And then you have the option to bind the form with submitted data if the form has been submitted. And in this case, the form will enter the state bound. You can also skip this step, calling setData. You don't have to call it. In this case, setData will implicitly be called with the value null. Okay, so setData is always called. This is important. Now, when you call setData, when you pre-populate the form, the code for that usually looks something like that. You create a new object, or you retrieve it from the database, and then you set it to the form. The object has some values, and what happens is that the object is written into the form. Then the properties of that object are written into the fields of the form, and so on and so forth, until the full form tree is populated. About the same happens when you submit the form. You can enter some new values here. You press submit in your controller. You call the bind method. What happens is that the form tree is updated with the submitted values. But here we have the first problem. The submitted values, as you might know, follow the CGI protocol, and which only transports values as strings. So all of these values are strings. But originally, our form contained different data types. Like here a float, here integers, string, whatever. So we end up with the first problem that we need to solve this impedance mismatch. We need to convert from one data type to the other and back, okay? And that's why I'm talking about data formats today. So every form stores data in two different formats. The model format, which is the format that you use in your application, in your domain model, and the view format, which is the format used in the view, which is usually a string. Okay, for example, the text type stores data as string in the model format and a string in the view format. It's the same. It's very simple, straightforward. You enter some text, the text is returned to your application, and that's it. The number type is a bit more complicated. The model format of the number type is a float, and the view format of the number type is a localized string, which is some string, you can see it in the example here, with some localized comma separator and stuff like that. So if you are in the US, you would see a dot as comma separator. If you are in Germany or in some other country, then you would see a different comma separator. So that's the two different types here. For the data type, things are getting a bit more complex. You have 3 different options for the model format and 2 different options for the view format. The different options for the model format are string, which is like day, month, year, you know, integer, a Unix timestamp, array, which is an array day, month, year as well, and a datetime instance. You can configure which of these formats you want to use using the input option. The view format has 2 different options, which is a string and an array, and this depends on the widget option that you pass when you create the date field. So in the first case, here we have a single text. We pass the single text value to the widget option. In that case, the view format is a string. In all the other cases, the form is represented by multiple fields, and in that case, the array, the view format is an array. Okay? So this is very flexible, this is very powerful, but it has one very serious consequence, one very serious implication. The problem is, if you want to have some custom logic on that field, and you want to access the data, you always have to think about, oh man, which format, which options are currently passed to that field? Do I receive the data as string or as array or whatever? It's very, very complicated. So when you, for example, create an event listener for that field, that's pretty much impossible because you have to create a switch statement if whatever. You have to care about so many different conditions that this becomes a real pain. So this is the reason why forms store data not only in 2 formats, but in 3. The third one is the normalized format. This is not configurable. This is static. And you can rely on that whenever you access the data of the form in some normalized, generic way. and it will always be the same format. So in the case of the date type, the normalized format is a datetime instance, and you will always receive that datetime instance. And this is very simple. This is very cool. Okay? So my first tip for you today, because this talk is not called Symfony Form Tips, but Symfony Form Tricks. Yeah. Whenever you create a custom type, think about these three formats. Think about what format do you want to return to your application. What format is required in the view? Is it a simple text field? Is it a list of fields? Do you need an array or not? What is the normalized format? Which format would you like to work with when you want to attach custom logic to that field? Okay? It's very important. Now, the transformation between these different formats, the model format, the normalized format, and the view format, happens using data transformers. So whenever you call setData, the data will be written into the form instance in the model data format, will then be transformed to the normalized data, normalized format, and then transformed to the view format using the model transformers and the view transformers. Okay? The same happens when you bind the form. When you bind the form, some stuff happens first that I'll be talking about a bit later on, and then the bound data, more or less, which is in more or less view format, is reverse transformed to normalized format using the view transformers again, and then reverse transformed to model format. This way, the three formats are always kept synchronized. Okay? So each of these transformers is an implementation of data transformer interface. If you know anything about mathematics, like theory, this is a bijective function. It has two parts, transform, which transforms from format A to format B, and reverse transform, which transforms back from format B to format A. And bijective means that you can apply these two functions onto each other, and you should always end up with the same results. So if you convert a value using transform and then immediately call reverse transform, then you should end up with the original value. Okay, that means bijective. And to show you how to create a custom data transformer, I've come up with a small example here, which is very common, a choice or text type. You have a choice field. The choice field contains a list of choices, and it also contains the special choice other, which lets you enter a new value into the text field that is standing nearby. Okay? So in order to create that field, the first thing we've learned we need to do is to decide which model format, normalized format, and view format we have to use. So one possible option is to select a string as model format, which is the value that you have selected in all of the widget, like in this abstract conceptual widget. The normalized format would be the same, and the view format at last would be an array containing the values of the choice field and the text field. Okay? And then we need to create a transformer, value to choice or text transformer, which transforms between this string and this array. Now, there's still a little issue with that selection. And do you want to guess? Does anyone have a clue what could be problematic about that? The problem is that you are losing information in the normalized format. In the view format, you know if the user entered something through the choice field or through the text field. In the normalized format, you don't. This is normally not a big problem, but it can be. In some cases, it might be that you want to decide if the user entered the value through the dropdown or through the text box in some event listener or something like that. So my second tip for today is the normalized data should contain as much information as possible. Don't try to trim it down or try not to lose information in that format. Okay? So a better choice here is to add the value to choice or text transformer as model transformer, and let the normalized format contain also an array with all the information that you have. Okay? Yeah, the transformer implementation would be pretty simple. It would be some implementation of data transformer interface. I'm not showing the code here. You have the concept you can implement. You can try it yourself at home. Okay? So in order to create that transformer, we need to look at two different cases. One case is when we select the value from the dropdown. In that case, the input would be disabled, and we want to return the value that is selected here. So what happens when we bind? We look at the choice. We look at the array that is bound. This is stored in the choice or text field. It's also stored as normalized format because we don't have a transform between these two. And now we are looking in the value to choice or text transformer whether the value of the choice field is other or anything else, or a list of the choices. Now, we see that it's not other, so we select that value and return it and store it as model data. Okay? Second case is when you create a new team. You select other here, you enter a value in the text box, and the same happens. You pass that array as view format, as normalized format. Again, you check the value of the choice field. In this case, it's other, so the transformer returns the value of the text field to the application. Okay? So, and considering these two cases, you can create a value to choice or text transformer pretty easily. My third tip for today is, if you create a data transformer, never, ever, ever change the information that is stored in the data. So, as an example, you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't transform from one format, which contains the date September 27th of 2012, to a different information. The year differs. It's not a different format, but a different content. Okay? I'm not going into the details of why you shouldn't do that, but you shouldn't. It's rather complicated. You can get some issues. It can be hard to debug later on. Always think of that. Transform between representations, but don't change the information. If you want to change the information, you should use events, and I will be talking about that later. Okay? So a much better way here would be to transform, for example, to a datetime object. This is a different representation of the same date. It contains more information, but that is not a problem as long as this process is deterministic. Okay? So, the last example about data transformers that I'll be giving today is when you want to create a field type that is very similar to an existing one, but a bit different. You want to support a different type. For example, you create a custom myDateTime class, which is an extension of PHP's datetime class. This is very common because datetime sucks. And you would end up with a field something like that. The model format would be myDateTime, normalized format would be datetime, and the view format would again be an array or a string, just like with the normal date field. Now the problem about that is that you are recreating a lot of logic that is already contained in the date field. Okay? So everything that you have here is already implemented by Symfony. So a much better way here is to reuse the information that is stored in, or that is implemented by Symfony. So we can create myDate field as an extension of date. So we will inherit all the formats and transformers and all the stuff that is attached to the date field already. And what we can do is we can prepend another model transformer. Okay? So essentially, we are first converting from myDateTime to datetime, the PHP class, and then the transformers of the date type are doing all the rest for us. Okay? We don't need to do anything else. And what we can see here quite clearly is that transformers can be chained. You can apply one transformer after another, and this allows you to create extensions of existing types very easily. And that is true for both the model transformers and the view transformers. Okay. Now, you probably remember this screen from the beginning. Changed to a different topic. We were talking about pre-populating a form with values. In this case, the employee object that you have here is written into the form, into the root form of the tree. And the big question is, how can we write the values of this employee object into the fields of the form? We also have the question that when the form is bound, when the form is updated with new values, how can we write these new values back into the existing object? You know that Symfony uses some getter, setter, magic, array stuff. Nobody knows how it works. And the concept behind that is data mapping. Data mapping is the exchange of information between a form and its fields. Its children, you could say, in the tree, because it's not the descendants, but only the immediate children of the form. So in this case, for example, when you call set data on a form, the employee object is stored, and then the data mapper makes sure of calling setData on all of the children of the form using some logic that you can decide. So Symfony's default data mapper calls the getters of all the different fields and does the same when updating a form after binding it. So it will call getData on each of the children and call the appropriate setters. Okay? Pretty straightforward. A data mapper is also a bijective function. It has two methods. It's an implementation of data mapper interface. And it has the method map forms to data, a list of forms to some data, and map data to forms, which is the other way around. It maps a data to a list of forms, which would be the children of the form tree. Okay? Is that somewhat clear? Anybody with me at all? Ah, cool. In Symfony, we only have one implementation of that data mapper interface, which is the property path mapper. This one uses getters and setters. As you have seen before, it can also deal with arrays and uses array indices in that case. And you could easily create different data mapper implementations, for example, a DOM document mapper, which would allow you to pass a DOM document, an XML DOM document, to the form, and the data mapper would take care of extracting nodes and writing the values of these nodes to the children of the form and back. This is a very nice, if anyone wants to implement that, I'm happy to see the implementation. Or an EAV mapper for entity attribute value implementations, which can do the same for that. Okay? So, because data mapping is not that easy, as I've presented it right now, I want to show you some examples with special edge cases that you need to solve in a different way. So one very common edge case is terms and conditions, which might be a field that you want to store in your form, but you don't want to expose it in your domain model. So for example, we have an order object and an order form for that object, and we have a checkbox for terms and conditions within that form, but we don't want to store that value, that value of the checkbox, this Boolean value, into the order object. So we want to actually decouple the data of this field from the object, okay? And Symfony offers a very simple option for that, which is called mapped. And when you set that option to false, the value of that field will not be synchronized with that object. So no getter will be called, no setter will be called. If it's an array, nothing will be written or read or whatever. Essentially, this means that you need to explicitly set the default value of that field, either by passing the data option or by calling setData explicitly. And you also need to explicitly read the value out of the field because, of course, otherwise you cannot access that. Okay? A second example is when you want to use customized getters and setters that are different than the name of the field. So usually if your field is called name, Symfony will use getName and setName to write or to read and write the values. If you don't want that, if you want to use getFullName and setFullName, you have a separate option which is called property path. With the property path option, you can specify exactly the name of the getter and setter used. The same is true if you want to access a property. So Symfony will check if you have that public property available, if you have the public getter-setter pair available. It will try a few different options, and you can use the property path option for that. It is also possible to specify Symfony to use array access. So for example, if the employee class implements the array access interface, you can make Symfony to use the array access syntax here. Okay? And this is possible by using property paths in squared brackets. You can also chain getters and setters. For example, if you don't want to call getName, but you want to call getPersonalDetails, getFullName to fill the value of that form, you can use the dot as separator of these properties. Okay? And the same is also possible. You can mix and match brackets and dots and whatever. There's an example here. So in this case, at first the index is accessed and then the getter, and here also the index and then the setter. Okay? So this is very powerful. This is very flexible. You can essentially decouple the structure of the form tree from the structure of your domain model. This is very nice. And the last example I'm giving here is when you want to disable by reference handling of the form in the data mapper. So essentially, what happens when you fill that form is Symfony will call the setter on the address object. So in this case, the difference to before is that you have an employee form, you have an embedded address form, and the address form has a street field and a city field. Very simple. When you bind that form, Symfony will fill the values of the fields, will call the setters on the address object, so set street and set city, but it will not call set address on employee because it knows that address object is a reference and that it is not necessary to call set address. This is usually quite cool because you don't need to create the setter if you don't need it, but in some cases, you want to call the setter, you want it to be called. And in this case, you can use the by reference option. You just set it to false, and then exactly that happens. Okay? So these are the three major possible problems that you can have with data mapping. And that's the ways to solve them. Okay? If we look again at the example from the beginning, we were talking about an employee form with a date field. And the date field has 3 fields: year, month, date. If we think about data mapping in that case, and do it like we just described, we would call date get year here. Obviously, this doesn't work because the datetime class doesn't have a get year method. It doesn't have a get month method. It doesn't have a get date, birth date, get day method. And what we need to do is essentially transform the datetime object into an array and read the indices of that array. So what is happening is the model data, which is the datetime object, is transformed to the normalized data, transformed to the view data, which is also an array, and then that view data is written into the values of the fields using the setData method. And this is very important because if you have a form, the values that are actually written to the fields of that form are extracted from the view data, not from the model data. So if you add any transformer to your form, then you will probably have any issues if that transformed value cannot be mapped. Okay? So this is very important to keep in mind. Anybody with me still? Let's recapitulate what we talked about. We have data transformers. Data transformers do the modification of a data's representation. Not information, but representation. The data mapper does the exchange between the form and its fields. Data exchange. Okay? And the last missing step I want to talk about today is events. Events make it possible to not change the representation of data, but to change the information that is contained within that data. You can do filtering, you can do cleaning, you can dynamically modify forms. Basically, events can be used for everything that you want to imagine, everything that needs to be dynamic or flexible. Okay? The first example is when you simple filtering. Basic filtering. You want to convert the value of a field to lowercase, or you want to strip all HTML text, or whatever. In this case, we will stick with lowercase. What happens when you bind that field? When you bind that field, the value Symfony, as submitted by the user, is written into the field as view format. It is converted back to a normalized format with this, which is the same in the text field. And now you have the bind event. The bind event allows you to access the value in normalized format and do stuff. Change it, modify it, change the form, do whatever you want. In this case, we can use this event to change the value of that field to lowercase, and Symfony will continue transforming the changed value that we changed in that event to model format, and will also continue to transform the value back again from model format to normalized format to view format to make sure that the 3 formats are actually synchronized. Because otherwise, if you wouldn't transform that back, then the view format would remain Symfony with uppercase, and when you redisplay the form in case of some errors, you would have a problem. So that's the way to go. That's the bind event. This is one of the most common events. You can use it for many, many different things. The most important of that is filtering. Okay? In your form type, This is very easy to do. You just access the field that you want to add the event listener to. You add the event listener, you choose the event that you want to attach the event listener to, and you can pass a simple closure doing the transformation of the data. Okay? The second example is data-dependent forms. Imagine, again, our employee form. We have an employee that can be in a leading position or not. It can be the CEO or whatever. And in the case that the employee is in a leading position, we want to have a field department where we can enter the department that the employee is leading. And if it is not in a leading position, we don't show that field. Okay, that's very simple, a very simple example that shows a big problem. So a very common way to approach that is to pass the employee to our form type. I often see people doing it like that. Store that employee and access it when we build the form to add the department field or not. Okay? Who is doing this like that? Who has done this before? Nice. This is wrong. This is wrong, people. The simple reason is that there is a big difference between form types and form instances. Form types usually exist exactly once in your application. You have multiple forms, but one form type. If you pass the employee object, you assume that all of your forms modify the same employee object. I guess you don't want to do that. Okay? So form types should only have dependencies on global they should only have global dependencies that every instance of a form of that type needs. For example, an entity manager or a service container or whatever, okay? But something global that every form needs. Form instances exist multiple times. And the more important thing is that the data of a form instance can change any time after the construction. In the form type, you are only in the construction time. But if the data is changed after that, your form will not adapt to that data, okay? So this is a very big problem, and this will expose itself when you are using such a form in collection forms, in something more dynamic. Okay, so you should never, ever do that. Don't pass data to the constructor of your form type, please. Instead, you can use the preset data event. The preset data is called at the very beginning of the set data method. So what it essentially does, it allows you to attach children to the form before actually processing the set data method. In this case, we add the simple department field because we know that the employee is in a leading position. Then Symfony goes on to set the data to the form. It sets the model data. It transforms it to normalized format. It transforms that one to view format. And at last, it begins with the mapping process and writes the department value to the value of that field. Okay? This is very powerful, very simple. The implementation is not very complex at all. It's a bit complex, I'm honest. But I'm going to change that. I'm going to fix that soon. Right now, you have to retrieve that form factory to create a field later on. But basically, what you do is you create an event listener in your form type, the build form method. And in that event listener, you can access the data of the event, which is your employee object, which is currently written into the form. Access any method to determine whether this employee is in a leading position. And if it is, you can add a new field that you create using the form factory. I want to simplify this step a bit, so it's not that tedious. But basically, that's the way it works, okay? This is how you should do that. And actually, you should also call the remove method in the else clause, because if you call set data multiple times with different employees, then you want to remove the field again if the condition is not true anymore, okay? So that's the way to go. All of you. Let's sum that up. We have two different processes in the form. We have the form pre-population, when we call set data, and we have the form update, when we call the form binding, when we submit the form. When set data is called, the first thing that happens is the preset data event. As I just have shown, you can use that to modify the form tree, to add children, to remove children, to modify the data that is set, that is written into the form, do any of that stuff. Afterwards, the data that results from that event is written into the form, transformed to normalized format, transformed to view format, and then mapped to the children of the form. At last, at the end of the set data method, post set data is that the event post set data is fired. I don't have a clue why we need that. It's just there for symmetry because preset data and requires post set data, right? I guess. If you know a use case, please let me know. The second method that we have in forms is bind, which is for updating a form with submitted values. So what you pass to bind is usually an array or the request of Symfony, which is then turned into that array, blah, blah, blah. The values of the first thing that happens is the pre-bind event. The pre-bind event can also be used to modify the form tree based on the submitted values. So for example, if you do any DOM modification, JavaScript foo stuff, and you want to synchronize the DOM tree or the form tree to the DOM tree, to the changed DOM tree, you can use the pre-bind event to do that. You can inspect the values that have been submitted, and you can remove fields, add fields, do whatever crazy stuff you imagine. Okay? The next thing that happens after that event is that the values of that array are written into the children of the form. So the whole form tree to the leaves is updated with the values that have been submitted. Within these fields, the values are transformed back to model format here and here and here. And these model format, these model data of the fields are then mapped into the employee object of the form, which is then reverse transformed again to normalized format, which is passed to the bind event. You can use the bind event again to change the object, to do other stuff. And at last, the employees transform to model format before invoking the post-bind event. And the post-bind event can be used, for example, for validation. You know that after the post-bind event, no changes will occur anymore in the form tree. No data transformers will be applied anymore. These values are static. So the post-bind event can do anything which is just introspecting the form tree, doing logic based on that. Okay? I see lots of these. You have any questions? There you go.
Do you have a preference on whether it's better to define all the fields you could possibly need and then remove them through events, or if you should define the smaller amount and then add them?
You should actually, if you have dynamic fields, you should always add and remove them within event listeners. Because otherwise, if you have, for example, many fields, you will create a form with lots of fields, and this is a lot of logic that is happening. This is actually slow. So you should only add and remove fields when actually needed. Okay? Larry?
Can you use these mechanisms to wire up client-side dependencies? This form field should only display if I select this value in this other field? Or is that a totally different thing?
It is actually possible using events. It's kind of tedious as well. It was one of the questions that I have put into the form survey that I have published a couple of months ago. This is a bit difficult. It's the typical scenario. You have a country, you want to select a province, but only from a list of provinces that depend on the selected country, and then you have a city that is also something like that, right? So this is kind of difficult. It is possible using events, but it's totally difficult. And I'm currently working on resolving that and making that easier. But until then, you should use events for that. There is also a question on Stack Overflow that answers this question with a code sample, and it's pretty detailed. You can do it the same way as there. The question was if, with the city, province, or state, province, and city example, if the best practice would be to populate the province drop-down with all of the available provinces and then use JavaScript to display only a subset of them. And the answer is that I don't know which is the best option. I haven't found one definitive answer yet. Probably it also depends on your use case. So what was said is that it probably depends on the market that you develop the site for. So if you have a market that has a high probability or has somewhat of a probability that JavaScript is disabled, then you should probably do it that way. Otherwise, not. Okay, the question was, what are the best practices in terms of performance when creating big forms? The answer to that is that, first of all, you shouldn't do any custom database queries. Symfony is optimized to reuse information in entity fields. If you have an entity drop-down that selects among multiple entities of one class, for example, with Doctrine, you shouldn't pass these entities manually. if possible, because Symfony does lots of optimization internally that helps when you display such a field multiple times in the form. So that's one of the major performance bottlenecks, actually. And other than that, you have to profile. You can't generalize the answer to that. The question was when you want to display a drop-down for selecting among different entities and at the same time having the opportunity to create a new entity, how to do that. The answer is to create a type similar to the choice for text type that I presented in the presentation. You have to do it yourself because it depends on what information do you want to enter for the new entity. Do you want to just create one or two? That's very specific, so you should just create a custom type for that. The question was if you embed a form, if you embed a form into another form, that the layout is rather quirky because the embedded form is displayed within a box, within a separate div. And if you can change that, well, you can create a custom theme for that. You can override the default theme to not create a div around the embedded form, which is quite easy, actually. Any more questions? Okay, then thank you very much.